Hello, everyone. Welcome to the university's Studying Slavery Conference, hosted by Georgetown University. This panel is titled, On These Grounds, Creating Research and Archival Tools to Aid Scholars, Students, and the Public. My name is Adam Rothman. I'm a professor of history at Georgetown University. And joining me today, an illustrious panel, Harriet Hamasi, Dean of the Library at Georgetown University, Sharon Leon, an Associate Professor of History and Digital Humanities at Michigan State University, and Brenda Gunn, Associate University Librarian for Special Collections and Preservation at the University of Virginia. We are joined together because the four of us are involved in a project called On These Grounds, funded by a generous grant from the Mellon Foundation. On These Grounds is an effort to come up with a way for all of the universities who are studying slavery to find a common approach to organizing the data and information that we find in our archives that touch on the history of slavery. This is a project near and dear to my own heart because I fell down an archival rabbit hole about 5 years ago, and I haven't gotten out yet. I was a member of Georgetown's working group on slavery memory and reconciliation in 2015, 2016. And as a member of that working group, I helped to launch something called the Georgetown Slavery Archive, a website dedicated to collecting and publishing archival material connected to the history of Georgetown, the Maryland Jesuits, and slavery. Working on the Georgetown Slavery Archive brought me into close collaboration with Georgetown's library and the incredible archivists and librarians at Georgetown. It introduced me to something I only had the vaguest idea of, which is the incredible richness and complexity of the archives in our own collection that had to do with the history of slavery, the archives of the Maryland Jesuits, correspondence and financial ledgers and sacramental registers and things like that, as well as the archives of the college itself, dating back to the 1790s that documented the use of enslaved people's labor on campus. It was almost a bewildering array of archives, and that's only Georgetown. All of the universities in the University Studying Slavery Conference, most of them anyway, are sitting on archives of different scope and size and content. And each of us so far has really been working independently to get a handle on our archival collections. On These Grounds is an effort to provide some kind of common understanding for all of us to get a handle on our archival materials. Let me just say one thing about something that inspires me about this project, and it goes back to the archives. In the late 19th century, after emancipation, a lot of freed people, formerly enslaved people, placed advertisements in newspapers like the Christian Recorder, seeking information about family, relatives, and friends who they'd been separated from during slavery. In the Christian Recorder, those advertisements were organized in a column called Information Wanted. Information Wanted. That phrase has stuck with me ever since I first came across those advertisements. And there's a wonderful digital project out of Villanova called Lost Friends that collects and publishes these Lost Friends ads. Information wanted, that means we both lack information and we desire information. And I think that idea, information wanted, really is at the core of what On These Grounds is all about. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to do so in a way that reflects on the larger possibilities and opportunities and challenges involved in the work of libraries and archives in the university studying slavery world. And I really can't think of a better group of people than the ones with me today to talk about that. I want to start with Dean Hamasi, who not only is the Dean of the Library at Georgetown, but before Georgetown was at Brown University. So Harriet has deep experience running libraries at universities that are deeply concerned with their histories of slavery. So Harriet, give us a sense of what you think libraries and archives can do to forward this work.
Thanks so much, Adam. Let me take a few minutes to share my screen. Great. So it's really a privilege and pleasure to be part of this panel and to also be at Georgetown. I want to begin by talking about the symbolic role of archives. Archives serve a role as guardians of history, culture, and memory, and they're often at the center of contemporary debates about the production of knowledge, the authorization of historical narratives, and provide impetus for changing views of history. The ideal archive would be one that contains a comprehensive record that is thoroughly organized and described. But the reality is that most of our archives are incomplete and in many cases unprocessed and totally unfindable. Archives often reflect just partial traces or fragments of history that they are meant to record. Here we see a map published in 1858 showing all the plantations, but none of the people, along the Mississippi River from Natchez to New Orleans. No matter the source or subject of the records, archives always contain a point of view. That point of view reflects the perception or experience of the person who created the record. In the case of slavery archives, most of the early records we see came from owners of enslaved men, women, and children, such as this runaway ad for an enslaved man named Abner, or this account ledger from the Washington Seminary, which noted that Gabriel was paid 6 pennies for weeding the garden, or this 1795 record of the marriage of an enslaved woman named Phyllis to David Thomas in Georgetown College Chapel. We note that the voices, humanity, and value of these enslaved people were not revealed in the examples. Over the last several decades, historians and archivists who have investigated the institution of slavery and colonial power have sought to break the chains of silence in the archive. Their work involves truth-seeking, acknowledging past abuses, addressing what's missing in the record, and attempting to bring forth the full humanity of the enslaved. More than 40 years ago, after publishing his path-breaking book, Sugar and Slaves, noted author and historian Richard Dunn began a major research project dealing with thousands of slaves who lived on 2 separate plantations, one in Virginia and the other in the Caribbean. Digging deeply into the archives, Dunn attempted to reconstruct the individual lives and experiences of 3 generations of slaves. Professor Dunn and other scholars have sought to read and rewrite the archive from the perspective of the enslaved, not as passive objects, but instead as active subjects and contributors to history and the historical record. The archive today remains the primary tool for producing new knowledge, for teaching us about history, and for helping us change how history is viewed and interpreted. Digitization has allowed libraries to open archives, to make documents available to researchers, to families, and to the whole world. The study of slavery has been enhanced by the work of archivists and historians who apply digital methods and technologies to their research. We've seen the growth of collaborative digital projects such as Enslaved Peoples of the Historical Slave Trade. Leadership for this project comes from colleagues at Michigan State University and the University of Maryland. Enslaved is a massive database that helps researchers and the general public discover, connect, and visualize more than 600,000 records about people, including individuals who were enslaved, who owned slaves, or who participated in slave trading. Harvard history professor Vincent Brown recently undertook an ambitious application of digital mapping in his project, Slave Revolt in Jamaica, 1760 to 1761. Through multi-layered interactive maps like the one shown here, Professor Brown demonstrates the strategies and tactics of the rebel slaves and the importance of their understanding of the landscape as the uprising progressed. Professor Brown emphasizes how historical visualizations can narrate a broader, more humanistic account of events like the revolt in Jamaica. Digital methods have also improved our ability to search and analyze the archive. Here we see the work of Emory University English professor Lauren Klein, who examined the digital edition of Thomas Jefferson's papers and their seeming erasure of Jefferson's chef, an enslaved man named James Hemings, the older brother of Sally Hemings. While the organization of the archive did not reveal the presence of James Hemings, meaning there were no letters to or from Hemings, Professor Klein's digital search and analysis of the contents of the archive revealed many references to Hemings and his family. As documented and shown here in more than 50 letters, James Hemings was not absent from the records, he was present, and the innovative use of digital tools and methods help identify and document his presence as well as his impact. By making the contents of archives more fully accessible, historical records can be examined and expanded, interrogated and interpreted, and seen with new eyes and in a new light. While these efforts cannot erase the systems of oppression or heal the oppressed, the archive can become a turning point in how we hear and see and understand the past, and also how we envision and construct the future. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Got a few dogs barking in the background here. Sorry about that. This is the world we live in now. A few of the, I just want to note that a few of the images that Harriet showed, the marriage, for instance, of Phyllis and David Thomas, the map of the Louisiana plantation, some of these are available on the Georgetown Slavery Archive website. Thank you, Harriet. That really gives us a wonderful sense of the range of digital humanities projects out there that are working with the archives of slavery. I think that brings us to Professor Leon, who is, I think, among us, the real technical expert in digital humanities methods. And also, I think it's safe to say that the guiding light and force and energy behind the On These Grounds project. I have to say that Sharon has been involved with the history of Georgetown and slavery for quite a while. I'm going to embarrass her possibly, but going back to her days as an undergraduate in the American Studies program at Georgetown, where she worked on a pioneering project called the Jesuit Plantation Project that made some of the crucial documents about the 1838 sale and Georgetown's history of slavery available online for the first time, well before the Georgetown Slavery Archive was set up. Sharon, why don't you give us a sense of moving from the broad contours of what Harriet talked about to the specifics of On These Grounds, your journey to this project and how you envision this project helping all of us as we get a handle on our archival materials.
Great, thank you, Adam. And in fact, you're didn't embarrass me at all. You've said some things that I was perfectly willing to say myself and will about that early experience. And I think, I have had the great pleasure of being able to collaborate with Adam and Harriet and Brenda on the work of the On These Grounds project. You can go ahead and share my screen now. For now, over a year and a half, it takes a little while to get one of these major grant funded projects off the ground. But as Adam suggests, my own journey in thinking about the larger possibilities of a structural response to the archival problem of surfacing the lives of enslaved people who labored in conjunction with colleges and universities really started as with my work as an undergraduate in American Studies at Georgetown. And so if any of you out there listening have any concerns about or lack of faith in the ability of an undergraduate curriculum to shape a student's life, I would like to assuage you of those concerns, because my junior year experience in American Studies introduced me to a direct, authentic archival experience for an undergraduate, which often doesn't happen, but really spent some time directly in the archives in combination with the introduction to what were at that point relatively new digital humanities tools, because we'll mark the year now at 1995. It was a long time ago. But the people who I was very introduced to in a very minor way in those experiences as an undergraduate stuck with me for many years. And I went off to graduate school and I circled back to the enslaved people who worked at Georgetown and for the Maryland Province Jesuits after I had finished my first project as a historian and had sort of developed a reasonably long career in digital humanities. And that circling back eventually led us to what is the On These Grounds project today, which is available at onthesegrounds.org. And if you go visit that site, there's not a lot there yet. We've been working hard for almost a full year, but we're just getting ready to sort of reveal the fruits of our labor. But in 2015 and 2016, I myself was coming back to the questions that I had about the enslaved people who labored in Southern Maryland for the priests who founded Georgetown. And so I went in search of a fellowship to spend some time in the archives. And I got to spend, almost 4 months sitting every day in the reading room at Georgetown, reading the Maryland Province Archives papers from beginning to end, because I was convinced, as Harriet suggested, that the enslaved people, and Adam too, that the enslaved people who worked in conjunction with the university were present in those archives, but really not revealed in the traditional finding aids or organizational approach to describing those materials. And I had an idea that if I went through and pulled out everything that I could find at the same time that Adam and his team were working on the Georgetown Slavery Archive, that I could use the tools of linked open data and digital humanities to try and get a shared sense of the lived experiences of these individual people. So not so much focusing on the documents as documents, but actually the experiences that were represented in them. And because I'm somebody who's kind of a structural thinker and has spent a lot of time working in building digital tools and digital systems, I started to wonder also about the possibilities for everyone, every institution and historian who is thinking about the long trail of impact of slavery and experiences of slavery with in the United States. I was primarily thinking about in the United States, but obviously it's a global problem with colleges and universities. What could we know if everyone in the group that makes up the University Studying Slavery group together took the same approach to describing the experiences that were represented in their archival material? Now, not everyone has the same kinds of experiences. Not everyone has the same kinds of labor or living situations represented within their archival material. So the experiences that I was seeing in the Georgetown collections would not be the same as would be present in the collections at UVA or in South Carolina or in Mississippi or in New Jersey. And so it seemed to me that we could take an approach if we work together in a collaborative way, historians and archivists, to build something that would let us have a structural approach to describing those experiences. Now, at the same time that I was doing this work as a historian, I also run a web publishing platform called Omeka, which is really two web publishing platforms. But Omeka S provides a way for people who are not technological experts to build and use a linked open data model. And you might say to yourself, what is linked data? Well, linked data is an approach to expressing information on the web that says that every entity can be connected to every other entity in both a human readable way and a machine readable way. So we might say that this person who labored at Georgetown belonged to this particular Jesuit, or was related to this other person who labored not at Georgetown, but labored in Southern Maryland. And so through the combination of the research interest and the sort of larger structural view that we could take based on the tools available to us, I reached out to my friend Brenda, who happens to run archives and special collections at UVA, and Adam and Harriet, and said, what if we tried together right now, while we have this opportunity with all of these universities thinking carefully about this history, to put into place a structure that would let us all together see what labor in this very particular kind of situation might look like, what might make it look different than labor at an agricultural site or an industrial site or an urban domestic site. And so with Omeka S, one of the things that we can do, this is where we pause and say, then we wrote a long grant to the Mellon Foundation, and we thank them for their support because they're making all of this work possible, the work of creating the data model that might be useful to all of you. With Omeka S, we have the possibility to use a regular web interface to build a set of templates that actually will let us describe the events and the people that appear in the archival records that might be sitting in your own collection. And so together, the group from UVA and the group from Georgetown and my group at Michigan State and the group at Omeka have spent the last 9 months working very, very hard to develop what we believe is a generalized form that will allow historians and archivists at universities, colleges and universities around the country to represent the events that they see in their archival materials related to slavery. And that means not only creating the forms to create the items, but also developing a set of very carefully considered controlled vocabularies to describe what kinds of events are happening. Are they labor events? Are they personal events? Are they sort of life course events, health related events, violence, punishment? We're seeing all of these kinds of things. And so we have an initial data model that will allow you as an individual to say, I see this event in the archival material, and I'm going to give it a title and a description and a type and so forth. And then we can publish that on the web. And if we all do it together and we all use the same data model, we can then look at these materials at scale. We can see what the experience of enslavement at colleges and universities might look like across all of the East Coast, over to the West Coast, and down through the Gulf. And so we're just rolling into the possibility where we're looking for testing partners to see how well we've done in filling out and building out this initial data model. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A period. But you may have a group at your college and university who is willing to test our model and help us make it better. And now I'm going to try and figure out how to stop sharing my screen so I can hand this back to Adam.
Sharon, thank you so much for that introduction to On These Grounds. You have a knack for explaining, I think, rather complicated technical aspects of the project in ways that the rest of us, including myself, can understand. I'm no technical expert. I think it's important to emphasize that this is going to be a great tool for scholars and students of history. And as you say, will allow us to make connections and draw comparisons across all our institutions. I think it also will help individuals who are looking for people, their own ancestors perhaps, in these archives, so that other people don't have to do what you did, which is to sit for 4 months poring over the Maryland Province archives or the financial ledgers of UVA or wherever they're looking for this information. So I think this project is going to be useful on a number of scales. Before we turn to Brenda, I just want to remind folks that you can use the event platform to ask us questions, which I will field and relay to the panelists. We're already doing that, seeing some good questions coming in. I also want to remind everyone that this panel is being recorded and will be available for posterity. So if you miss something, you can always go back and check it later. Sharon, also thank you for the reminder about the call for testing partners. I think that's really important. We definitely want to bring more schools and colleges into this project. Speaking of testing partners, Brenda, it's been wonderful to have you and UVA as a partner on this project. I think ours is one of the first intercollegiate collaborations on this kind of archival work, trying to develop a common model. UVA obviously has been wrestling with this history for a long time. It's been a leader in this field, an originator of the university's Studying Slavery Consortium. And you all are sitting on an incredible array of archival material. Can you talk a little bit about how On These Grounds might help your archives manage this collection and manage this material, and then some of the challenges that have come up as we pursue this study?
Thank you, Adam. I'm glad to do that. And I want to begin by acknowledging my colleagues at UVA, Kurt Von Dock and Ashley Schmidt, who are also involved On These Grounds. And of course, they're very intricately involved in the university's Studying Slavery program. And you started off the program, Adam, by saying we're all joined together. And I think that's a concept, the joining together of archivists and historians and scholars. in this work that we're doing. And so I just want to underscore the collaborative nature of this, and that we're all sort of in this together to call attention to and bring about an awareness of these voices that are in our collections that may not have been visible before. So for a little UVA perspective, I'll mention again, Kurt Von Dock has been working for years in the university archives to uncover the lives and experiences of the enslaved who labored to build the University of Virginia. And an example of the work that has come from that deep dive is the Digital Humanities Project, Jefferson's University, The Early Life, which was co-founded by Maury McInnes, who was at UVA at the time, but now is president of Stony Brook University, and Kurt. They were the co-founders. The site includes personal and administrative documents relevant to those first years. Kurt and a team of graduate students continue to mine the archives of the small special collections library. And we're so happy that they're doing that. I think we're serious partners in this endeavor because we, the library, archival, and memory workers, also seek more evidence and traces of enslaved people from whom we need to hear and to listen and to better understand their experiences and to acknowledge the trauma of and the impact of slavery that it reverberates in the present over and over. Harriet mentioned in her talk about unprocessed, incomplete, and unfindable archival materials. So I want to speak just a little bit about that. These are concerns of mine, and they're concerns of any and all of us who are stewards of archival collections. When the graduate students and the scholars and the descendants of the enslaved come to the archive, they are relying on descriptive products that we create. Or they're relying on our institutional memories of what has come in, but that isn't readily or easily discoverable by the public through our online catalogs, through our finding aids, and our finding aids that are on regional or national aggregators, or in our digital media repositories if we're talking about digital content. These tools that our research public know to use are often not completely representative of our holdings. And this project presents an opportunity to take a close look at our holdings and our descriptions with an anti-racist lens and to find those voices that aren't accounted for but are present in the records. Yesterday at our library, I hosted a talk by a young scholar who happens to teach with Sharon in the history department of Michigan State. Her name is Nakia Parker, and you will be hearing more about her, I can assure you, if you haven't already heard from her. She's a historian of 19th century US slavery, African American, and American Indian history. And she said in her presentation that in her research, she, and I quote, privileges the perspective and the voices of the enslaved and other marginalized voices, end quote. Her statement reminds me of the work we have to do to redress the loss of these individuals. We have an opportunity to acknowledge that we've centered the institutional perspective in our work previously, and when that institution is a predominantly white one, then you've delivered your collections from a white point of view. Which brings me to repair and recreate. And I can't talk about this without acknowledging Lael Hughes Watkins' seminal article in the archival field. It's called Moving Toward a Reparative Archive, a roadmap for a holistic approach to disrupting homogeneous histories in academic repositories and creating inclusive spaces for marginalized voices. It is a seminal article for us, and I know many of us in the field are working with a reparative framework, and that can be traced directly to this article and Lael's influence. Lael is the university archivist at the University of Maryland, and she's involved in Maryland's USS project. So if she's in the room, hello, Lael, thank you, and y'all should give her a shout out for the great work she's doing and the leadership in this area. The article calls on us to adopt, and I quote, a multi-pronged approach for engaging in social justice through reparative archival practices when dismantling homogeneous or master narratives within academic repositories. And I would say that our work on these grounds is informed by a framework that intends to upend, to intervene, and to disrupt descriptive and subject heading systems that have been a part of the library and archival fields. We know there are many special collections and archival repositories that are looking at their descriptive work and practices and how they present their collections to the world. And you might be asking, why are we focusing so much on description and subject headings? And the answer is because this is how researchers find library and archival material. These are really the keys to discovery. So I want to say a little bit about trauma in the archives. And though we didn't write this grant to include any consideration of trauma that the records with which we are working contain, and the impact that the records carry for the project staff, we have the ability to think about it in a deliberative way and what the impact is for our staff who spend many hours going through the material, such as what Harriet showed you earlier. And when we think about staff's exposure to the trauma in the records, we have to think about our researchers and the impact of the trauma on them. In special collections at UVA, we recently had a faculty member broach this subject with our instruction librarian. The professor had made an assignment for her students to use material that documented enslaved lives. And the students reported to her that working with the material was very difficult because of the subject matter. And I've heard experienced scholars say that the exposure sometimes becomes so much that they have to walk away and keep some distance for weeks at a time. So it's not a matter of being new to the archive or being new to this type of material. We know that exposure, no matter where you are on the researcher experience, can have an effect. And so we want to acknowledge in that trauma can affect people who are trauma survivors who use the archives. It can affect people who have a traumatic reaction when they use or are reading the archives held in the records held in archives, and can affect staff being who are working with the archives. So this trauma-informed practice is all acknowledges that it's all around us, and we want to be developing tools and practices to deal with it and to make it a part of our everyday work. So what does this framework mean for library, archival, and memory workers? It means that we put people first. And when creating descriptions, when designing our reading rooms, when managing our cataloging and processing units, that we be aware of the impact that our collections can have on the people who use them. So I'll end with an appreciation for being in conversations with the scholars who are working in this field and for being involved in this project and for the people, the other people you've heard from today. I think like this grant, we want to place value in a collaboration between people who work closely in a variety of ways with material that document enslaved lives. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Adam.
Brenda, thank you so much for that. I just want to echo your the principle of putting people first. I want to reiterate that because I think at times some of these digital projects and some of the emphasis on viewing archival collections as data collections to be mined for scholarship, we run the risk of losing sight of people and talking about them or thinking about them in an abstracted kind of way. But if we remember to put people first, I don't think we'll make that mistake. And I hope that On These Grounds is really pushing in the opposite direction, to put people first as we work through these incredibly complex and diverse archival materials. There was a question that came in that perhaps Sharon and I can answer. It's from a White Marsh descendant, which is wonderful to receive, about the diaries and letters of Fathers John Lewis and Thomas Diggs. And this question is asking whether efforts have been made to mine the diaries of the Maryland priests to extract references to the enslaved families.
Yeah.
Sharon, you might know.
Yeah, I do.
About that.
I
Yeah,
do.
Go ahead. Okay. Take it away.
Yeah, so absolutely. So some of those materials are in the Maryland Province Archives collections, and some of those materials are in sort of a larger grouping of collections called the Catholic Historical Manuscript collections. And so I've been through all of them. And I have a lot of stuff from John Lewis, and I know that Adam's group has been through them. I have less material from Thomas Diggs, but it was really important to me, as Harriet suggests and as Brenda had suggested, that not only are the materials processed in a way that are processed from the point of view of white archivists and white historians, but also from the point of view of the white creators of the archival record. And so it was important to read everything in there. And there's good evidence of certainly Lewis's interaction with and oversight of the people who lived at White Marsh. A little bit less from Thomas Diggs. Adam, do you have any recollection of? I don't have much Diggs stuff.
Yeah, I don't either. I would just add that Georgetown's library is currently involved in a project of digitizing the entire Maryland Province archives. So someday, in the not too distant future, this material is actually going to be available and accessible to the public online. I do want to emphasize that digitization is not the same thing as analysis, and it's not the same thing as preservation. And just putting material online is great and important, but it's just the first step. It's just the first step. And it's also, a labor-intensive one as well. So these kinds of projects are operating and being conducted on a number of different levels, and they all relate to each other. Another question that came in, it's Sharon and I and other historians and other scholars, it's been a year since most of us were actually in an archive, which has been distressing and sad for us. But, maybe there's light at the end of the tunnel and we can start getting back into archives. And there's a question about what researchers can do to help archivists who are engaged in this work. I think that's a really important question because people like myself are always asking archivists to help us. So what can we do to help you?
Oh, I love this question. Thank you to whoever you are who are asking it. I can't see who you are, but thank you. It's a great question. We would love to be in conversation with our researchers. And we're thinking about at the University of Virginia about how to normalize this interaction and how to maybe formalize an exchange of information. I don't quite know what that looks like yet, other than emailing us, but it's sometimes we're approaching the researchers, you're here to do a thing, you may have a limited amount of time, so we sometimes are hesitant to jump in and engage you on what are you finding, is there anything for to share, right there at the point at which you're actually using the material. But I think that we need to think harder about how we can approach researchers and ask you, maybe when you leave the reading room or follow up with an email, is there anything that you've seen in the collections that you've been looking at that jumps out to you, that isn't reflected in the finding aid or the catalog records? What are the surprises that we obviously haven't seen ourselves? Otherwise, it would be described. I think that just really being honest and transparent about about so many of our collections aren't reflective of all of the people or the experiences that are involved, that are reflected there. And I think Harriet mentioned a really good example of this in the Emory professor's work with Jefferson's letters, and they're not described as having this content, really rich content about James Hemings, but you can go to those letters to find a good deal of information about him. So, so yes, conversations, we would welcome it. And if you have any ideas about how we can make this collaborative, we're certainly open to doing that.
Thank you, Brenda. We'll do one final question, and then I know Sharon wants to say one more thing about the call for testing partners, which is really important for us right now. There's a question about an appreciation, Brenda, for your comments about trauma, and a question for Harriet and Brenda. What kind of resources are your libraries offering to help staff deal with those challenges? Harriet, you want to field that one, if you know?
Well, I don't have a good answer to that. I will say that this is definitely part of many complex issues that universities and places of work are dealing with in general. And that is the response of the individual within the work environment. And Brenda, you may have more specific information about this, but we do know that staff are deeply affected by the materials that they work with, whether that is about slavery or about the history of concentration camps and so on. I mean, this is an issue that is so pervasive and is kind of amazingly coming forward at this time, at a time when people are no longer tolerating a kind of oppressiveness from many different sources. And to imagine that the work environment could be one of those sources is disturbing in itself. But Brenda, I think you must have some more specific examples.
Yeah, thanks, Harriet. I would start out by saying that the U.S. archival community is a little, we're just beginning to talk about this, and we're looking at the Australians and the Canadians who are a little ahead of us in addressing trauma in the archives, both in amongst staff and amongst the users of archives. And both of those countries are coming from it when in dealing with Indigenous records of Indigenous folks. So what we're doing in special collections at UVA is where I've put a cohort together to go through a trauma-informed practice course that the Australian Society of Archivists have put together. And I think that my goal in doing that, since it's really the only training program right now that's available specifically for an archival setting, is to adapt that to a US setting and to begin to think about having the principles play out in our setting. And again, like I said earlier, a big part of the trauma-informed practice is people first, and it's not just the staff who's working with, but we really are very also focused on researchers and how we can help help them deal with that. And one of the things, a major area that comes out in the small literature, but growing literature, is the use of contemplative practices, mindfulness and meditation and things like that. But it's also being aware of some of the symptoms of vicarious trauma, which can be very similar to PTSD symptoms. So trouble sleeping, irritability, there's a long list, and we've gone into and we've pulled from that from psychology sources and sociology sources. There's actually quite a extensive literature on secondary trauma in those fields. So it's a matter of us trying to adapt what we are reading from those professional settings into our archival and the research setting.
Brenda, thank you so much. I mean, just hearing you talk about that, and Harriet, reminds me of, I always say that history is too important to be left to historians, and this is one of the reasons why. Sharon, why don't you conclude this session with a little bit more information about On These Grounds and how people can reach out to us?
Absolutely. Let me share my screen one more time. Thank you, Adam. As I mentioned briefly earlier, On These Grounds is looking for testing partners, and our emphasis on collaboration, that call for testing partners is available at the On These Grounds site, which is onthesegrounds.org. And then you will see under testing partners, there's a call for testing partners. And those applications are due on June 1st. And what we're looking for is a combination of archivists and historians who would be willing to look at your local records and comment on the effectiveness of our model. And we have the ability to help support that work for 4 groups. So I really hope that you will take a look at the call for testing partners and consider applying. We will provide all of the documentation and materials that we can to everyone, not just the four groups that we can select. And as always, if you have questions or concerns, you can shoot them to us at our very simple email address, which is info@onthesegrounds.org.
Sharon, thank you so much. Harriet, Brenda, Sharon, thank you for joining me on this panel. I thought it was a really interesting conversation. I hope it provided a lot of information to the folks who are watching, and I hope it will inspire some of you to get involved as testing partners with On These Grounds. Good luck to all you researchers, archivists, students, descendants who are working with this material. It's great to be a part of the university studying slavery.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care, everyone. Bye.